We are back for our next session, which we have titled Flashtalks. So good luck. The IMF will be presenting their tool Stat GPT, and for that we have Jim Tebrake, who is Deputy Director of the Statistics Department of the IMF, Jeff Danforth, who is Program Chief at the IMF, and Ilya Gorelik, who's the Vice President and Head of Reliable AI Lab at EPAM.
Okay, well, welcome back, everybody. Hopefully you had a good lunch and some good opportunities for networking. As was mentioned, my name is Jim Tebrake. I'm the Deputy Director at the Statistics Department at the IMF. And this morning we talked a lot about data quality, and I think rightfully so. When you think about data quality, you think about a concept that's multidimensional. There's different things that define data quality. You have accuracy. You have timeliness of the data. You have the reliability or the methodological soundness of the data. And you have accessibility. Accessibility is an incredibly important dimension of data quality. And what we're hoping to do in this flash talk is to demonstrate to you how AI can be used to improve data quality by improving the accessibility of official statistics. Now, when you think about it, national statisticians publish a wealth of data each and every day for research purposes, for policy making, to allow us to monitor the economy, to allow us to monitor social trends and social conditions. And we do know that there's significant data gaps across the world in terms of the amount of data. But all that being said, there's a lot of data out there. But when you think about it, a lot of that data is not very easy to be accessed. And because we can't access it very well, it gets underutilized. So in the world of official statistics, we have an underutilization of all this data that we're investing in. And I want to motivate this use case that we're presenting to you with a very simple example. Now, assume that you're a researcher and you have a question. You would say, I'd like some indicators of economic growth and inflation for the U.S. And we as statisticians say, okay, we can help you answer that question. So what do? Well, what we do is we take all the data that we produce and we put it in different data sets, many, many different data sets. And we stovepipe that data between national accounts data, prices data, labor data. We put it here, there, and everywhere. And we use terms like CPI and GDP and BOP. In fact, many times we don't use words. We just use acronyms. And that's what we present to this researcher here who has this very basic question. So what does the researcher do? The researcher goes off and it looks through all of these data sets looking for the answer, looking for words like inflation or economic growth, not finding them. The researcher spends a lot of time looking for this data, and one of two things are going to happen. They're going to give up because they've just spent too much time looking for this data, or they're going to find data, but it's not going to quite fit exactly what they want, but they're going to use it anyway. So they're using kind of suboptimal data to answer their really important question. So that's really the problem case that we're trying to solve, and how can AI help us solve that problem case? So when Chat GPT came out about a year and a half ago, I think I, like many of you, decided I'm going to check this thing out. And so I put a bunch of prompts in there and I saw what it gave me back, and I was quite impressed. I mean, these were quite insightful responses I was getting, and I was, very much impressed. Then I thought, okay, I'm going to see if Chat GPT can give me data. So I said, can I have the U.S. GDP estimates for 1990 to 2022 in a table format worthy of a table I could give to my boss? And I watched the screen, and magically this beautiful table appeared before my eyes, well formatted, something I could just print off, give to my boss, go home and say, hey, job well done. I was elated. But that elation turned to disappointment when I looked at the numbers. I said, that's not quite the US GDP. In fact, I think that's Canada's GDP, and that's France's GDP, and something was amiss. But I couldn't quite give up on this idea that, man, this tool could be so useful in helping people access data. So luckily at the IMF, during that time, we had a data modernization project going on. And we were modernizing our processing and dissemination systems. And we engaged EPAM, a world-renowned IT provider, to build our platform. So I put the question to Ilya, and I said, Ilya, can we use AI to allow users to talk to the IMF data in their language, but you have to guarantee me that every number that they get back is 100% accurate. No hallucination, no nothing. And Ilya and his very innovative team at EPAM took on the challenge. And what they developed is something called that we call Stat GPT. And Jeff is going to give a little demo of what that is. And really at the base level, it allows you to talk your data. It allows you to discover your data, to gather your data, to transform your data, to learn about your data. And I think this has huge potential to open up the access to official statistics across the world. So over to you, Jeff.
Thanks, Jim. I'm just going to try and forward to the next slide, which I don't seem to be able to do.
It was on the other screen before for us.
This is a live slide.
Okay. Well, I mean, actually, while Jim was talking, I was thinking it may have been a strategic error to get two guys from the IMF to do a flash talk, because I don't want to speak for Jim, but I'm not particularly flashy, but I'll at least I'll try and be fast. If I can get my slide up. Oh. Oh, here we go. Okay. Great. Thanks. Okay. So as Jim mentioned, we had this problem statement. How do we develop an application that provides data with certainty? And so before we get to sort of Jim's test question about, CPI and GDP indicators, you might approach this system in a very sort of generic way. You might come to this particular application, you might say something polite. I think, we're all polite. Good afternoon. What do you have? I don't know what this is. I don't know how to use it. Give me some information on how this thing works. And the agent responds, and I'll talk a little bit about what we mean by agent, says, oh, good afternoon. I'm an intelligent agent. I'm sort of managing this thing called Stat GPT. And here's how it works. We have a sort of SDMX-based data model. I want some information on 4 indicators, and here's the data sets that I sort of understand. So please help me build the query for you. And just before I get on this idea of a query, this agent concept is quite important. So really the way this application is built is there's a whole bunch of agents. Those agents do different tasks, and there's one agent that sits above them all, and that agent's job is to assign those tasks to other agents. So it's a whole bunch of agents that are doing sort of very specialized things. Now, Jim mentioned the challenge statement that there can't be uncertainty, there can't be hallucination. So how do we get around that problem? Well, actually what this application is doing is not finding data at all. What this application is doing is working with the human, the user, to build a query. And once that query is built through a process of interaction with that human person, when we submit that query to our SDMX API, we know with certainty what's going to come back. So we're really not asking this application to find data. We're asking this application to build a data query. Okay, so coming back to Jim's question, you now understand how the system sort of works. So you might say, well, I'm interested in GDP and CPI indicators for G7 countries. So the sort of assigner agent recognizes that there's some elements of this sentence in this question that it knows what to do with from a query building perspective. And one thing to point out, I don't know if you can see it, but I didn't spell country correctly there, right? So that's an honest typing mistake. It doesn't sort of bother this system. It really understands intent quite well. So it recognizes that I've asked for things that look like indicators, GDP and CPI, and I've asked for something that looks like a country group. And it's returned, it's gone through these data sets that it understands and found some gross domestic product series, some CPI series, and it's found some in growth, some in levels, some in indexes, and it's returned a country group called the G7 country group. Okay, so what do I do next? Do I like that response? Maybe I'm going to tell it to do something more. I know the indicators, or I know the dimensions that I have to play with, and I'm going to continue to sort of populate this query. Well, I don't actually want the G7 country group. I want the countries that are in the G7. So I'll say, well, add the countries from the G7 group instead. And so it understands, first of all, which countries are in the G7, and it understands that I want those countries instead of the group. So how does it understand the countries, and how do we know that it's going to produce those countries, the right 7 countries each time? Well, we've given it sort of our enterprise business vocabulary, so our code lists that represent all of the sort of country groups that we use in the IMF. So that's another way that we're assuring that there isn't hallucinations. We know with certainty which countries are in the G7, and we ensure that that certainty is reflected in this response. Okay, so remember the original indicators that were returned, there's a mix of current prices and constant prices. And again, speaking to Jim's point about, the way the language sort of humans use when they talk about things versus the way we describe indicators, I might say, well, I don't really actually know what the difference between constant prices and current prices is, so I'm just going to ask that question. Well, the response agent, again, this is sort of an agent that's responding to generic questions instead of building queries, different agent. Nice little description about the difference between current prices and nominal prices. And I see in this response that, current and constant prices, I see that, they're really talking about nominal and real series. And those are words that I understand. Those are words that I've heard before. And I might read this definition and think, I'd really like to modify my query to deal with only the real series. But I don't want to have to reconvert and think, do I have to refer to those as constant or current? I'm just going to ask it for what I want. Please keep the real series. So this is interesting, and it's worth pausing here for a second. It really understands intent. So just to be clear, those indicators do not have real in the metadata. There's no description of that indicator that says it's a real series. It understands this equivalence between sort of real and constant prices. And so when I say keep the real series, it's really removing all of the nominal ones. And it's doing that based on its understanding of these words. So it's taken out some nominal series, it's kept some real ones. And you can see I'm going through this process of a conversation with this assistant, and I'm slowly building up a sort of query that I'm interested in. And again, CPI, keep the inflation indicators. Again, there is no inflation in this metadata. None of the descriptions of those CPI series had inflation in them. It knows that inflation is the change in an index. So when I say keep the inflation indicators, it's only keeping the percent change of the index series. And this is really the power of the large language models. I think we had something about machine readable versus machine understood. This is a little bit of that, right? This is an understanding in a natural language way what it is that the user wants. What is my intention? Again, I go back 10 years. It is adjusting the time period. I didn't do an adjustment of sort of quarterly versus annual. But again, you get the idea. Across these 4 dimensions it's looking for information for. I'm giving it the information that it needs. Finally, I'm really happy with what they've come back. I've looked at this query. We've built it together. And now I want the data. Well, at this point, this query is certain. I have a set of countries. I have a set of indicators. And all it's doing is writing the SDMX query that I need to submit to the IMF's SDMX API. That thing in blue there is the actual SDMX API call. If you copy that into the browser and hit enter, you would get back all of the data that you were looking for. We do the same thing in Python. If you have a sort of Python editor in front of you and you enter that into Python, you would get the data back out of the IMF's API. We also produce some sort of simple outputs. This is a table of the data that you were looking for, and we do some simple charts. Now, that's really sort of the baseline what we've built. This is sort of the very simple querying tool and very simple outputs. But one of the things that we're experimenting together with EPAM is, well, people don't just want simple charts. Maybe they want something that's a bit more sophisticated. So we could ask the sort of next version of this application to do something like this. We'll plot a line chart for each country, label each line with a name, and do it in dark theme. And what's interesting about this response, this is a different agent, and this agent is really just writing Python code. And this agent is not only writing the Python code, but telling you how it's going to write the Python code. And this is something about understanding the process that it's going through that is really important. It's really important for us to be able to audit it, to read it, to understand it. And so it says, well, first I'm going to create a subplot, listing plot line, then I'm going to loop over these, and for each country I'm going to do this. Then I'll finally create a country, and I'm going to label it, and this is what it's going to look like. And not only is it telling you what it's going to do, it's showing you sort of what the Python code is related to that, and it's doing this really quickly. It's kind of crazy to watch it, actually. So it's sort of producing all this Python code, and finally it's producing a very simple chart. So these are the series. It's done it in sort of dark format. It's labeled them, didn't use the country names, used the country codes, but you get the idea that this is something that, you know, as a charting tool, we think would be powerful. So maybe just on the last slide, talk to you about the bouncer agent, I maybe call it. So there may be really good reasons why we wouldn't want users to be able to ask a question like this: how great is Taylor Swift? Good question. Taylor Swift's not in our mandate, for one thing. So we want to make sure, and the other sort of reason why you might want to regulate these things is if you're thinking of token costs. So each one of these queries that's going to a large language model is costing you something. So even internally within the fund, how open do you want to be in terms of the types of questions that you allow users to ask? And you might want to sort of have an agent that's sitting on top regulating the types of questions that are able to be answered by this system. And that's what this agent does. You know, the agent sort of responds and says, well, I'm designed to interact with this application along a fairly narrow defined set of topics, and this isn't one of them, so I'm sorry, I can't answer this question. I think maybe that's another really important point, is that we've tried to create something that if the answer is we don't have it or I don't know, that's what the response should be. It shouldn't be like, well, I found something that's almost as good and here it is, right? We really want it, if it doesn't know, to say, I don't know. I think that's important. So next steps, I showed you a glimpse of this sort of charting tool, but you could think of the same thing in terms of data interrogation and transformations. Oh, I see that the CPI is got a base year of 2010, but I'd really like to have a base year of 2020 instead. Can you rebase it? That's something I think that would be fairly easy for this to do. And again, it's just Python code. Data interrogation. Remember, this tool, this application has no sense of the data. It's building a query. So it doesn't know if you said, give me exports for the countries that have the highest GDP per capita. It doesn't know what the GDP per capita is for any country. It just knows these dimensions that it's asked to build the query on. So maybe a couple of questions get you thinking. So, okay, we think StatGPT can unlock the value of IMF data, but why just IMF data? Any data that's machine readable could be unlocked with this tool. That could be international organizations, that could be Ghana, that could be Jamaica. So really maybe the role for the IMF and other international institutions to play is to really help with that data modeling piece. And maybe that's the necessary condition for tools like this to be able to use by whoever it is that wants to use them. So, you know, could a tool like StatGPT be used by all providers of official statistics to improve accessibility? Thank you.
Well, Jeff forgot to mention something that we absolutely delighted to show to you. And as the proud sort of fathers and grandfathers of this application, please visit us and find us, and we will show you how it can be used in real life. And it's actually quite exciting. Sorry, Jeff.
No, that's a good point, Ilya. Thanks. And I think we have time for questions.
So I guess I'll moderate the questions. So anybody have any questions? Yeah, if you could maybe make your way to the mic and then just introduce yourself. And yeah, happy to take your questions.
This is more nerve-wracking than I expected it to be, walking up here to the mic. Okay, for the purposes of this question, my name is Ibrahim. I'm applying for an internship at the World Bank. So maybe just under the hood question, is it a RAG? Well, what is going on here? A RAG being retrieval automated generator, is that what's going on here?
Not exactly. It's
Okay.
not simple RAG. It's more like embedding, semantic search, and keyword search, and this combination of all kind of tools, including fact that we need to understand metadata from IMF dictionaries and map it to English, and then we need to build this LangChain kind of engines, and this is more than just a RAG.
Okay, good. Maybe slightly, maybe less techy. This, can I do another one? Yes? Yeah, so this was quite a process, and it should be a process. And, you know, I'm not an intern or applying for an internship. In my organization, we're experimenting with some of this. This is quite a involved process, and you'll agree, and it should be one. And this is actually the hopeful way of thoughtfully working with large language models and such. My question is, once this is for a particular audience, but once this is out there, are you not disrupting yourselves? In the sense that then this is the content for a training set, for a supermodel, for a large language model and such, to essentially disrupt the step part of it. If you understand what I mean. So, this is the question that's been burning in my head all day so far, and I wanted to not to be the one asking this, which is, we've talked a lot about quality data, and data quality being an issue. My concern is, aren't the purveyors and the providers of quality data, NSOs, just setting themselves up to be loss leaders for language models?
Can I answer, or you want to answer?
Maybe I'll take that if I understand the question, but maybe you understand a little bit differently than I do. But national statistical organizations are in the business of producing data, and we get no joy out of producing the data if it's not used. So what we see a tool like this doing is increasing the use of that data by citizens, by governments, by policymakers, researchers, academics. Now, if we make our data more accessible to large language models and they can learn more from it, I think any national statistician will say, great, because they're using our data. Our data has gone through many, many quality checks along the way, and it's right. And so the more use we get of that data, I think we're extremely happy. So if I understood your question correctly, but I don't know if Ilya, you want to come in on that as well.
Just only one small comment. I mean, honestly, the whole LLM revolution, in many cases, especially here, is only utilization of a language as a natural protocol. Yep. Basically, we don't displace any existing APIs, we don't displace any existing data warehouses or any existing processes. All we do is to providing humanly accessible interfaces so that you who are not programmer and you who are not data scientists can actually interact with all this wonderful space. And basically, we're creating a place where 4 people get in the room together, data scientist, domain expert, programmer, and DevOps, because you need to deploy all these models and manage them and host them. All these 4 people getting in the room through this kind of a framework, and they cooperate through neural kind of assistance. So in reality, that's all. Sorry.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Yeah, I have a question here and then a question in the front.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Dunstan Mategenya. I'm a data scientist within TechDG at the World Bank. I definitely do agree that dissemination is one of the easy areas where large language models can be used to democratize access to data. And so this is one of the, I think, very low-hanging fruit in terms of applications. So this is very good to see. I have a couple of questions. The first one is just, of course, with this setup, since we're just accessing data, we don't expect the model to hallucinate. We don't expect some of the challenges or errors that large language models produce, but still there's potential for errors. So what I wanted to ask is any frameworks you've tested for evaluating the model? How did you check and evaluate the model and say that now it's performing well enough for us to put it out there, right? Because eventually we're going to start to produce frameworks to enable the other statistical offices to apply the same strategies. So I think coming up with evaluation metrics or strategies to make sure that it's working very well. Secondly, I was curious about the cost, right? As you mentioned, I suppose that you are using OpenAI. I don't think you are using any open source models.
Actually, no. In this case, we're using our own embedding, our own vectorization, and the only response time, we actually use a Mixtral. So in some cases, cost of this application is zero, considering the sort of CPU time. So it depends how detailed you want to be in providing the feedback.
Yeah. So the second one, yeah. So on the cost, I think it would be good to know like how the cost was handled. Finally, just on language, right? So the accuracy and quality is also going to vary depending on the language. So as I know, IMF provides access to data in different languages. So did you test this with just English, or how, are you thinking of doing it with other languages, and how was the quality?
Maybe you want to answer the question on the testing. I'll just get back to one question, your first question, I think, about how can we assure the certainty of the the product, if you would. And we heard a comment this morning about humans need to be involved in the decision making process. I don't know if that's exactly how it was said, but I kind of came to that. You have AI, but at the end of the day, it needs to be our decision. And that's what I think a little bit of the beauty of what EPAM has built, it does, is it puts the decision making to us. So it doesn't just go and get the data. It says, I'm going to build a query. Here's the parameters. Are you happy with the parameters? Yeah, I'm happy with the parameters. Or please drop this one, please drop that one. Okay, go get the data. And then it's running a query against the data. Now, that's using our API that's been heavily tested in terms of returning the right results. So it's using existing infrastructure that's well-founded, well-structured. So I feel very certain that you as a user are going to get exactly what you're asking for. And I think that's an important requirement that we have. But Jeff, over to you.
Yeah, no, maybe just a point on the testing. So again, to get where we are, we've gone through many versions. We've always had sort of the users involved. Maybe Jim and I are the heaviest users of the whole thing. So if there's errors in it, it's probably our fault for not catching them because we're the heavy testers. But just launched a sort of alpha/beta testing round with 25 users in the fund just this week. So we're hoping to get a lot of feedback from them and incorporate that feedback. I can tell you from an early version to this version that G7 problem was a real one. I remember when we had initial prototype, I said, well, which countries are in the G7? Instead of that question sort of being framed on our own knowledge base and our own code list, it was sort of the regular, GPT-4 response, and Switzerland was a G7 member and Germany wasn't. Now, of course, I know which countries are in the G7, and I sort of said, well, are you sure that Switzerland is a G7 member? And I said, oh, actually, you're right, it's not. I've corrected it. But we can't have that if you just have some sort of naive user who has no clue about the G7. They're not going to ask that question or catch it, right? So it has to be right. And so this is where we sort of went down that path of having, well, we have an enterprise business vocabulary. We have code lists for all sorts of things that we're very certain about. That should be what that response is built on. And that question about constant versus current price is a bit of the same idea. We want the sort of understanding of economic concepts to come from our methodology, our dictionaries, our understanding of what those concepts are, not the wild world. So it needs to be referring to our knowledge base.
We have a question here. Yeah, I don't know how long we can go on.
We're beyond flash time at this point.
So this is the last question.
Okay, the last question. Hello, everyone. My name is Chiwei Brithe. I'm an associate professor in Georgetown University, so focusing on data science and analytics. So that one, the software gave me very amazing impression over there. So I have a question about the data security, because I can imagine a lot of companies, they do not allow their employees to put any commercial things or any data or any of these kind of things online to use the OpenAI. And I can imagine for the starter, IMF, probably you just train your model in some kind of an AI environment within IMF. But if it's linking to the open access, for a lot of people can use that. The first question will be related to the data security. And the second one is how you can validate your data will be accurate enough. Because we can imagine if the data is not valid enough, but we put it already into the OpenAI, so that kind of things will be quickly powerful line to say that will be kind of fraud things happening. So yeah, I would appreciate your opinion on that. Thank you.
Great. I'll let Ilya answer that.
Sure. The question about data security is relatively straightforward because we actually writing query. Again, let's make sure that we don't really dispose any data to any model. We're just simply using best possible query generators to develop either SQL query or SDMX query or Python query or whatever you build. And then when you deploy this model, you have a data governance and you get data authentication. We're actually inside EPAM. We service hundreds of clients because it's a big company, and we've got a lot of experience in working with the data security for enterprises. And the part of the platform we created, which is basically we'll talk later about, called Dial, addresses the issue of governance, who can see what at the level of the data tokens. So basically, right inside the platform, which is called Stat GPT, we're using a lot of components for data security, governance, prompt administration, and making sure that nobody asks questions which they're not supposed to ask. And if they do, they either don't get answered or simply ignored. So that's about security. I hope I answered your question.
Maybe just to add that, there is no data going to the large language model.
Exactly. The data simply never goes to anywhere because all we do is build queries. And the second, even more interesting point, that even within the platform, you have a concept of authentication, and you can literally watch every word that person puts in. And if, say, for example, some secret terms cannot be ever revealed anywhere, that will be just abandoned and either obfuscated or ignored, because every prompt, before it gets executed, you have full power of studying. And that's what Jim told. Agent, number one, looks at the prompt and decides what to do about it. I don't know if it was helpful, but best I can do.
Great. Thank you.